who is not the main suspect but is maybe somehow involved could feel comfortable coming forward and giving that information and knowing that they...
Somewhere in Los Angeles, a man named Derek Colella sat across from prosecutors and admitted something that changes how you have to read every ransom note in this case from now on. He wasn't the kidnapper. He never claimed to be. But for months, he made himself part of the story of a woman named Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old grandmother who vanished from her home outside Tucson, Arizona, in the middle of the night, leaving behind bloodstains, a disabled security system, and a family that has spent 5 months begging for her return. Colella pleaded guilty this week to sending fake communications tied to her disappearance. And that plea, quiet as it was, forces a question the FBI itself now seems to be wrestling with in public. If some of the noise around this case has been fake, what does that mean for the parts that might be real? Stay with me, because this is where it gets complicated. Just days before Colella's plea became public, Reuters reported, citing an anonymous FBI source, that investigators had concluded none of the ransom notes tied to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance were genuine. It was a stunning claim, delivered the way these claims usually are. Unnamed source, no official statement, no chance for the public to weigh the evidence for themselves. And then, less than 24 hours later, something rare happened. The FBI's Phoenix office did something it almost never does in this case. It issued an on-the-record statement, directly contradicting its own leaked narrative. Some notes, the agency said, had been deemed extortion attempts without legitimacy, but others may potentially be legitimate and were still being investigated as such. The case, the statement made clear, remains an active kidnapping for ransom investigation. Think about that for a moment. An anonymous source inside the FBI told one of the largest wire services in the world that the notes were fake. And within a day, the FBI's own office undercut that story, on the record, by name. That doesn't happen by accident. Agencies don't correct themselves publicly unless something about the leak felt dangerous enough to need correcting. Dangerous to the investigation or dangerous to a future prosecution. We don't know for certain why that correction came so fast, but we do know it came fast, and that alone tells you something about how seriously at least part of the Bureau is still taking these notes. Here's what you need to understand about those notes, because there have been several, and they are not all the same. The first arrived just one day after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on February 1st. It was sent to 2 local news outlets and to TMZ, and according to people familiar with its contents, it contained details that seemingly only someone inside her home that night could have known. An Apple Watch left on the bedroom floor, a broken porch light at the back of the house. It demanded millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. A second note followed days later, similar in tone and language, but this one carried no ransom demand at all. Instead, it said Nancy Guthrie had died shortly after being taken, and, according to sources who reviewed it, the person who wrote it expressed regret that she had died. Investigators believe both notes came from the same source, possibly the same IP address. For months, that second note's contents were kept from the public at law enforcement's request. It wasn't revealed until June. Then there's a third channel entirely. Messages sent to TMZ, separate from the first 2, from someone claiming to know the identities of the people who took her, someone claiming to possess video. This is where things get serious, and where you need to hold 2 competing possibilities in your head at once, because both cannot be fully true. Either this is someone genuinely connected to Nancy Guthrie's abduction, sitting on evidence that could crack the case wide open, or this is exactly what Colella turned out to be. Someone exploiting a grieving, high-profile family for attention, or leverage, or some need we may never fully understand. The FBI itself seems split on which category each note falls into. That's not speculation. That's what their own statement says, in plain language. Some notes discounted as fraud, others still being taken seriously. And that brings us to the detail buried inside all of this that almost nobody is talking about yet. The idea that the person who actually knows the truth might not be the kidnapper at all. It might be someone standing just outside that circle, someone who saw something, drove someone somewhere, held onto a phone they were told to hide, someone who is, right now, terrified of what happens if they come forward, and terrified of what happens if they don't. What almost nobody watching this case understands is that there is already a legal pathway for exactly that person to step out of the shadows without stepping into a courtroom as a defendant. It has a name. It has a track record, and according to one of the most experienced criminal defense attorneys in the country, it may be the single most realistic way this case gets solved from here. If you think this story deserves more attention than it's getting, share this video, because somewhere out there, the person who could end this is deciding right now whether to make that call. Here's the part of this story that almost never gets explained clearly, and it matters more than anything else in this case right now. There is a legal mechanism that exists specifically for people like the one who might be sitting on the truth about Nancy Guthrie, someone who isn't the mastermind, who may not have planned any of this, but who knows enough to end it. Criminal defense attorney Mark Garagos, a lawyer with decades of experience handling exactly these kinds of high-stakes negotiations, has said publicly that this is precisely the moment in a case like this when that mechanism becomes most useful. And ask yourself why that timing matters. Because according to Garagos, the earliest hours of an investigation are almost always about pure detective work, physical evidence, forensics, canvassing. But once that window closes, cases like this are rarely broken by new evidence. They're broken by people. Specifically, by someone close to the crime deciding the risk of staying silent has become greater than the risk of talking. So, what does that pathway actually look like? It starts with something called a reverse proffer. In a normal proffer, a defendant's lawyer brings information to prosecutors, hoping to trade it for leniency. A reverse proffer works the other way. The lawyer goes to the government first, before any formal charges, and essentially says, "I represent someone who may have information relevant to your investigation. I'm not naming them yet. Let's talk about what that information might be worth." It's a negotiation that happens almost entirely through attorneys, often before the client's identity is ever revealed to investigators. Garagos has described handling these kinds of inquiries directly, people reaching out anonymously, sometimes through his website, arranging contact through untraceable means, testing the waters before ever giving their name. This changes everything we thought we knew about how a case like this could realistically end, because it means the person who solves this doesn't have to be found by the FBI. They could choose to be found on their own terms, with a lawyer negotiating the exact shape of their exposure before a single word of what they know reaches a prosecutor's desk. But here's where it gets complicated again, because coming forward isn't free, and it isn't simple. Prosecutors don't just take someone's word for it. According to Garagos, for every person with genuinely credible information, there are far more who aren't legitimate at all. People driven by attention, confusion, or in some cases documented mental health struggles that have nothing to do with the actual crime. A defense attorney handling one of these calls has to test it. Does this person know something only someone truly involved could know? Do the details line up with evidence that hasn't been made public? Only once that credibility is established does the real negotiation begin. And that negotiation can take several forms, each with a different level of protection. The lightest version is sometimes called a queen for a day agreement, a deal mostly used in federal cases, but increasingly seen at the state level too, where whatever a person says in that room generally cannot be used against them later, with a few narrow exceptions written into the agreement itself. Go further, and you get formal use immunity or transactional immunity, arrangements that can be put in writing and are, in Garagos's words, as legally binding on the government as any other contract. The government can't simply promise something informally and walk it back later, not without consequences. Think about what that means for someone who might have helped move Nancy Guthrie, who might know where a phone or a hard drive is hidden, who might have heard something they were never supposed to hear. It means there is a door. It's narrow, and it requires trusting a system that this same person may have every reason to fear. But it's there, and according to Garagos, it has worked before, in cases far outside the true crime headlines, in situations where a single cooperating witness changed the entire trajectory of an investigation. There's another layer to this that deserves attention, and it's uncomfortable. Garagos has pointed out that these deals aren't just about protecting the cooperating witness, they're also about protecting the eventual prosecution. If the FBI had let Tuesday's anonymous report stand unchallenged, and it later turned out those two central notes were genuine, a defense attorney at trial could use that public contradiction to attack the credibility of the entire investigation. Every official statement made along the way becomes potential ammunition in a courtroom, years from now, in front of a jury that wasn't paying attention to any of this when it happened. That's part of why the Bureau's swift, on-the-record correction this week may matter more than it first appeared to. None of this guarantees Nancy Guthrie's case gets solved. It doesn't erase 5 months of silence or the pain her family has lived with since the night she disappeared. What it does is lay out in plain terms that a resolution may not depend on a new fingerprint or a new camera angle. It may depend entirely on whether one person, somewhere, decides that the fear of staying quiet has finally outweighed the fear of speaking. If you're following this case, subscribe, because the next update could come from exactly the place we've just described, a phone call nobody sees coming. Ask yourself this: what if the motive everyone assumed from the very beginning has been wrong the entire time? That's the theory that's quietly persisted longer than almost any other in this case, and it comes from someone whose job for decades was reading exactly this kind of crime. Retired FBI profiler James Fitzgerald, known for his work helping identify the Unabomber, has said from his earliest conversations about this case that he never believed it was really about the ransom money at all. His theory, and it remains a theory, not a confirmed finding, is that this was never a kidnapping for profit. It was personal, specifically personal to Savannah Guthrie. According to that theory, the notes demanding cryptocurrency were never the point. They were noise, opportunists circling a tragedy that had already happened for entirely different reasons. Fitzgerald has argued that what he calls proof of life games, followed later by demands framed around proof of death, don't read like the behavior of someone who actually planned a kidnapping for financial gain. They read, in his words, like manipulation, people capitalizing on a situation someone else created, and he's not alone in that skepticism. Forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Bricado has expressed similar doubts about the authenticity of the notes overall. This changes everything about how you have to weigh the FBI's own contradictory signals. Because if two independent behavioral experts don't believe the notes are genuine, and yet the Bureau's official statement says at least some of them may be, then either the experts are missing something the FBI has and the public doesn't, or the FBI is being deliberately cautious about closing a door it isn't ready to close yet. This is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because it forces you to sit with an unresolved contradiction rather than a satisfying answer. There's a detail in this case that has nagged at investigators and outside experts alike from nearly the first week. No note was ever left inside the home itself. Every single communication came later, through media tip lines, through TMZ, through channels that involve computers, IP addresses, timestamps, all things that can be traced, or at least attempted to be traced. If this had been a straightforward, planned kidnapping for ransom, the far safer move for whoever did this would have been to leave instructions on paper, inside that house, before ever vanishing into the night. No electronics, no digital trail. Just a note and a phone number for a burner. That it didn't happen that way doesn't prove anything on its own. But it's exactly the kind of inconsistency that makes experienced investigators pause. What do you believe explains that? Drop your theory in the comments, because this is one of those details that splits people who followed this case closely right down the middle. Here's what we do know, without speculation. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in the Catalina foothills area outside Tucson on the night of January 31st into February 1st. Her security system had been disabled. Bloodstains recovered at the scene were confirmed to be hers. 10 days later, the FBI released doorbell camera footage showing a masked individual outside her home the morning she vanished. a person the Bureau has since publicly described as a suspect, though not by name because his identity remains unknown. DNA evidence recovered from the home has been part of the investigation from early on, complicated, according to reporting, by the fact that the samples recovered were mixed. A reward now totals more than $2 million combined between the family and law enforcement. And 5 months later, despite all of that, there has been no arrest, no confirmed identification of the man in that footage, and no verified proof, one way or the other, of whether Nancy Guthrie is alive. Savannah Guthrie has spoken publicly about this more than once, always carefully, always aware of the strange position she occupies. A journalist whose own family's tragedy has become national news, covered by her own colleagues. She's said she believes at least some of the notes are authentic. She's also acknowledged, in her own words, that she doesn't know for certain which ones to trust. That tension, a public figure forced to hold out hope and manage skepticism at the same time in front of cameras, is not a detail true crime coverage should gloss over. It's one of the most human parts of this entire story. So where does that leave things? It leaves a case sitting at the exact intersection this entire discussion has been circling. A bureau publicly insisting some leads remain live, behavioral experts publicly doubting the physical evidence tied to those leads, and somewhere, potentially, a person who knows which side of that argument is actually true. Whether that person ever picks up the phone, whether they ever sit down with a lawyer and start the kind of conversation Mark Garagos described, may end up mattering more than anything the FBI's forensic lab produces from here forward. This case is not solved. It may not be solved for a long time, and there is a real possibility parts of it are never solved at all. That's not the ending anyone following this story wants to hear, and it's not the ending I wanted to write either. But 5 months in, with the physical evidence largely exhausted and the experts split, the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie may not come from a lab. It may come from someone finally deciding they can't carry it alone anymore. If this story stayed with you, share it and stay with us, because the moment this case breaks, it likely won't come from a headline. It'll come from a phone call nobody sees coming.